Commander Vex of the Arkari Defense Fleet had spent 74 cycles watching his species die. The tactical display in front of him showed the same pattern he'd seen on 100 other screens across 100 other systems. Red dots, Xyloth swarm signatures, moving through the black like a plague given form. His own forces, blue icons, retreated in a controlled but hopeless withdrawal. They had been retreating for 3 years. "The eastern flank is collapsing," his tactical officer reported. Vex didn't bother to look up. He'd heard those words in variations so many times they'd lost all meaning. "Pull them back," he said. "Regroup at the Callies Nebula. We can make a stand there." "There's nothing to stand with, Commander. We lost the 7th Armada at Thrax. The 4th is scattered across 3 systems. Our reserves are." "Reserves?" The word came out bitter. There were no reserves. The Council had scraped together every capable warship from every member species. The Arkari, the Vel, the ancient Trell, all reduced to watching their fleets burn against the endless tide of chitin and hunger that was the Xyloth swarm. The war had begun as a border dispute, a system claimed by both the Xyloth and the Council's exploratory division. Negotiations failed. The Xyloth didn't negotiate, they consumed. They'd eaten their way through 4 Council member species before anyone realized the war wasn't about territory. It was about extermination. "Commander," his communications officer's voice cracked with exhaustion, "we're receiving a priority broadcast from the Council seat, all remaining vessels." Vex straightened. The Council seat had been evacuated 3 weeks ago. Their temporary command center was a mobile station tucked behind the defensive lines of the Trell homeworld. If they were broadcasting, it meant the war had reached a new phase. "Put it through." The image flickered to life. High Counselor Morath, an elder Trell whose age was measured in centuries, looked smaller than Vex remembered. His luminous eyes had dimmed. His ceremonial robes hung loose on a frame that had lost weight. "Commanders of the Coalition Fleet," Morath began, his voice steady despite everything, "I address you now in what may be our final moment of unity." Vex's claws tightened on the armrest of his command chair. "The Xyloth advance cannot be stopped with conventional tactics. Our best intelligence suggests their swarm occupies 3/4 of the galactic arm. We have lost 2/3 of our combined military strength. The remaining Council species are preparing for extinction-level defense protocols." Morath paused. The silence stretched long enough that Vex could hear his own breathing. "There is one possibility," the High Counselor continued. "A theory proposed by the late Director of Xenological Studies. He believed that there exists, in the forgotten sectors of the galaxy, a species with the capacity to wage war in ways we cannot comprehend. A species defined not by technological advancement, but by biological and psychological warfare capabilities." Vex leaned forward. He'd never heard of this theory. The director called them a dormant threat. His research suggested they had achieved spaceflight, but chose to remain isolated. Radio signals from their sector stopped decades ago. We assumed they had destroyed themselves, as many primitive species do. Morath's eye seemed to focus on something far away. "We were wrong. The signals didn't stop. They became encrypted, strategic. The species continued to develop, hidden from our observation, waiting." "Waiting for what?" Vex muttered. As if in answer, Morath continued, "They have intercepted our distress broadcasts. They know our position. They know the Xyloth's position, and they have responded." Vex's bridge went silent. Every officer, every technician, every warrior on the command deck held their breath. "Commander Vex," Morath said directly, "the signal came to you. Your fleet's position is closest to their designated territory. They have asked for tactical data. They have asked for coordinates. They have asked for casualty reports." Vex stared at the image. His mind raced through possibilities. An unknown species, emerging after decades of silence, offering help. It was unprecedented in his experience. Council contact protocol for newly encountered species required years of observation, cultural exchange, diplomatic vetting. When will they arrive? Vex asked. Morath's expression shifted to something Vex couldn't quite read: fear, relief, no, something stranger. Their message, Morath said slowly, did not specify an arrival time. The message was 3 words. Vex waited. Send coordinates now. The transmission ended. Vex's officers exchanged glances. The tactical display continued to show the inexorable Xyloth advance. In 7 hours, the swarm would reach their position. In 12 hours, they would be overrun. In 24 hours, the last Arkari defensive position would fall. Communications, Vex said, his voice finding a steadiness he didn't feel. Record a message. Transmit on all frequencies. Include our exact position, the Xyloth swarm composition, and a detailed casualty breakdown from the last 3 major engagements. To whom, Commander? Vex looked at the empty space where Morath's image had been. He thought about the director of xenological studies, dead now for 18 months. He thought about the primitive species from the Forgotten Sector, the ones who'd gone silent decades ago, hiding behind encrypted signals that no council species had bothered to decipher. The humans, he said, send it to the humans. He didn't know why, but the word felt heavy in his mouth, almost as if speaking it into existence had consequences he couldn't yet understand. Commander, his tactical officer interrupted, the Xyloth advance has accelerated. They'll reach our position in 4 hours, not 7. Vex nodded. 4 hours. If the humans were coming, they'd have to move faster than any known propulsion system allowed. If they were coming at all. Prepare defensive positions, he ordered. We hold this line until reinforcements arrive or until we're dead. And if the humans don't come? Vex turned back to the tactical display. He watched the red dots multiplying on the edge of the system, spreading like blood in water. They'll come, he said. He didn't believe it, but he'd spent 74 cycles watching his species die. At this point, what was one more hope to lose? The Xyloth reached the system's outer defense grid 3 hours later. Vex's fleet engaged. And the humans didn't come. 6 hours after the Xyloth engaged the Arkari fleet, Commander Vex was dying. Not metaphorically. The bridge of his flagship had been breached in 3 places. Atmosphere vented into space, carrying the bodies of 14 crew members with it. He'd sealed the inner compartment, but the emergency systems were failing. His left arm hung useless at his side, a shard of debris embedded in the joint. The tactical display flickered. The blue icons were few now, maybe a dozen ships still capable of combat. The red dots were everywhere. Commander, his tactical officer gasped. The young Arkari had a wound across her chest, but she refused to leave her station. The fleet is breaking. I'm seeing individual captains initiating suicide runs. Vex understood. Better to die fighting than to be consumed by the swarm. The Xyloth didn't take prisoners. They didn't accept surrender. They simply ate. Make sure their names are recorded, Vex said. Their families. There are no families, the officer cut him off. There's no one left to record anything. She was right. The Arkari homeworld had fallen 2 years ago. Vex had lost his mate, his children, his entire bloodline to the swarm. He'd continued fighting because that was all he'd ever been trained to do. The humans, someone whispered. Where are the humans? Vex had no answer. The coordinates had been sent. The plea had been made. But the humans hadn't responded. He wondered if they'd even received the message or if their technology was too primitive to. Signal incoming. Vex jerked upright, ignoring the pain in his arm. What signal? His communications officer, one of the few remaining crew members with both arms intact, stared at his console with an expression of pure confusion. I'm reading a ship, Commander. A single vessel, it just appeared. No wormhole signature, no jump trail. One moment empty space, the next moment a ship. Battle stations, Vex shouted. Is it Xyloth? No, the signature is wrong. It doesn't match any known configuration, but it's human. Vex pushed himself to the viewing port. The armored glass was cracked, but he could see through it. The ship was ugly. That was his first thought. Council vessels were elegant, curved, designed for both functionality and aesthetic dignity. The human vessel was a block of metal with engines strapped to the back. It was covered in weapon ports, dozens of them, hundreds of them. There were no smooth lines, no decorative flourishes. It looked like something built to survive a collision, not to win a beauty contest. Identify, Vex ordered. Do they respond to hails? Negative. They're broadcasting a signal on a secure military channel. I'm decrypting now. The voice that filled Vex's bridge was calm, almost bored. This is Commander Tors of the Terran Defense Force. We have your coordinates and casualty reports. Stand by for engagement. Vex's mouth opened to demand clarification, but then the human ship began to move. It accelerated faster than any ship Vex had ever seen. The hull glowed with heat as it punched through the Xyloth swarm's outer perimeter. Instead of stopping to engage, it kept going, cutting a line directly toward the swarm's central mass. What is it doing? His tactical officer breathed. The human ship didn't engage at long range. It didn't deploy fighters or drones. It simply flew into the middle of the Xyloth formation and detonated something. Vex's sensors went white. When the light faded, 1,000 Xyloth vessels were gone. The human ship was still there, its hull scorched but intact. Commander, his communications officer said, his voice trembling. The human ship is transmitting new coordinates. They want us to jump to a rendezvous point 2 systems away. They want us to retreat. No, Commander. They're telling us to clear the engagement zone. They're saying they're about to use high-yield weapons and they don't want to accidentally hit friendlies. Vex stared at the tactical display. The Xyloth swarm was regrouping. The hole the human ship had punched through was closing, but the humans didn't seem concerned. Retreat, Vex ordered. All remaining vessels retreat to the designated coordinates, now. His captains complied without question. The blue icons moved away from the red dots, and the human ship waited until they were clear. Then the humans showed the council what war actually looked like. Vex watched from his new position as the human ship unleashed weapons that defied every principle of space combat he'd ever learned. Kinetic projectiles accelerated to impossible speeds, missiles that split into hundreds of smaller missiles, energy weapons that didn't disable, they disintegrated. But that wasn't the terrifying part. The terrifying part was how the humans fought. They didn't defend their position. They didn't establish a perimeter. They simply advanced, firing constantly, ignoring the Xyloth's return fire. When one human ship took damage, another took its place. When a Xyloth vessel got too close, the humans rammed it deliberately, using their ships as projectiles. Commander, his tactical officer whispered, they're not even trying to survive. Vex watched as a human ship, crippled and burning, turned toward the swarm's largest vessel and accelerated to ramming speed. The explosion was magnificent. It took out 30 Xyloth ships in a single flash. The swarm began to break, not because they were defeated, there were millions of them, but because they had never encountered anything like this. The Xyloth were used to prey that ran, that hid, that died in terror. The humans didn't run. They didn't hide. And they seemed to think death was an acceptable exchange rate for victory. Get me a direct line to the human commander, Vex said. Channel open. Vex took a breath. Commander Tors, this is Commander Vex of the Arcari Defense Fleet. We thank you for your assistance. We are prepared to coordinate a joint assault on the swarm's leadership vessels. There was silence for a moment, then Tor's voice returned. Your assistance is not required. We're terminating the swarm. Please remain in your position until the engagement is complete. The line closed. Vex watched the human ship continue its slaughter, and he realized, with a cold certainty that had nothing to do with the temperature of his bridge, that the Council had made a terrible mistake. They hadn't summoned help. They'd summoned something else entirely. The battle lasted 11 hours. When it ended, the Xyloth swarm had been reduced to fragments. The human ship, which Vex now understood was one of 6 that had arrived during the engagement, drifted among the wreckage, still burning in places but unmistakably victorious. Vex had never seen a Xyloth swarm retreat. They didn't retreat. They didn't understand retreat. They consumed until they were consumed, and that was the end of it. But the swarm in this sector had retreated. The humans had pressed them so hard, killed them so efficiently, that the swarm's collective hive mind had made a decision that should have been impossible. Escape. Commander, his tactical officer said, her voice hollow. The human ships are requesting permission to board our vessel. They want to hold a formal meeting. Vex looked at the 6 human ships through his cracked viewing port. They were still ugly, still covered in weapons, still radiating an aura of barely contained violence. Grant permission, he said. Bring them to the observation deck. The observation deck was the only part of his flagship that still had atmosphere and structural integrity. Vex had his remaining crew clear debris and stand at attention. It wasn't much, just 14 officers, most of them wounded, all of them exhausted, but it was all he had left to represent the Arcari. The humans arrived 20 minutes later. They didn't come alone. A squad of armed soldiers flanked their commander, their weapons held at low ready, their eyes scanning every corner of the deck with practiced efficiency. Vex had never seen a human before. The Council's xenological archives contained old images, blurry, captured from long-range observation, but nothing had prepared him for the reality. They were smaller than most Council species, softer. Their skin was exposed in ways that seemed almost obscene, and their eyes, those strange, round eyes that darted everywhere, held an intensity that made Vex want to step backward. Commander Tors, Vex said, extending his right arm in the traditional Arcari greeting. Welcome aboard the Fist of the Arcari. The human commander was shorter than Vex expected. Scarred across the right side of his face, the damaged tissue forming a pattern that Vex recognized as combat healing. He wore a uniform of dark fabric, practical and unadorned, with rank insignia that Vex couldn't interpret. Tors didn't return the gesture. Instead, he walked past Vex to the observation window. He stood there for a long moment, looking at the wreckage of the Xyloth swarm, and then he turned to face the assembled Arcari. Your fleet is destroyed, Tors said. Your species has lost its homeworld. Your remaining colonies are cut off and surrounded. Vex felt his mandibles tighten. We are aware of our situation. Are you? Tors stepped closer. Because you just called us here to fight a war you can't win. That suggests you aren't fully aware of anything. Vex's officers stirred. One of them, a young Arcari named Tel, stepped forward with his hand on his weapon. Commander Tors, Tel said, his voice shaking with anger, we have lost everything. Our families, our homes, our future. We called for help. We did not ask to be insulted. Tors looked at Tel. There was no anger in his expression, no frustration, just something that looked almost like sadness. You think this is an insult? Tors asked. This is the truth, and you need to hear it. He gestured to the 6 human ships visible through the window. We came here because you asked, but we didn't come to save you. We came because the Xyloth are a threat to us, and we needed to eliminate them before they reached our territory. Vex felt the words hit him like a physical blow. Your territory. The Council's records show your species is confined to a single system. Our records show that too, Tors said. Your archives are outdated. We've been expanding for 70 years. You just didn't notice because you were too busy dying. He turned back to the window. Here's the reality, Commander. The Xyloth swarm that attacked you wasn't even their main force. That was a scouting element. The main swarm is still 3 systems away, and they're coming. The observation deck went silent. The war you thought you were fighting, Tors continued, isn't the real war. It's just the beginning. In 6 months, the Xyloth main force will arrive. They will consume everything between here and your council seat. And your species, along with the Vel and the Trell and every other council species, will be exterminated. Vex stared at the human. How do you know this? Because we've been watching them for 40 years. We've been mapping their movements, analyzing their behavior, predicting their expansion patterns. We know exactly when they'll arrive, and we know exactly what they'll do when they get here. So you've been planning for this, Vex said slowly. You knew the Xyloth were coming, you knew we were losing, and you waited. Tor's eyes met Vex's. We waited until you were desperate enough to listen. Listen to what? The human smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. Listen to our terms. The council seat was a mobile station designated Unity's final light. It had been designed as a temporary headquarters, but it had served as the seat of council government for the last 18 months, ever since the Xyloth overran the Trell homeworld and forced evacuation. High Counselor Moreth sat in his quarters, staring at the tactical display that covered one entire wall. The Xyloth advance was still there, red dots spreading like an infection across the galactic arm, and yet, for the first time in 3 years, there was something else. Blue dots. Human vessels, moving through the swarm, engaging and destroying with a ferocity that Moreth had never witnessed. He'd been alive for 312 years. He'd seen wars, plagues, civilizational collapses. He'd never seen anything like this. High Counselor, his aide, a young Trell named Soren, entered without announcement. The human fleet has cleared the outer systems. They're requesting a diplomatic conference. Moreth didn't turn from the display. They're requesting, or demanding. Soren hesitated. I believe demanding is more accurate, High Counselor. Moreth closed his eyes. He'd known this was coming. From the moment the human fleet had arrived, from the moment he'd witnessed their combat capabilities, from the moment Commander Vex had transmitted his report, the words begging for mercy, used in connection with the Xyloth swarm, of all things, Moreth had known. Summon the remaining council leaders, he said. We'll meet them in the main chamber. The main chamber had once held representatives from 37 council species. Now there were 6. The Vel, the Arcari, the Trell, and 3 smaller species who had been fortunate enough to avoid the worst of the Xyloth advance. Moreth looked at them as they filed in, exhausted, frightened, hollow-eyed, and felt an emotion he hadn't experienced in centuries. Shame. He'd led the council for 87 years. He'd presided over an era of peace, prosperity, and expansion, and he'd watched it all crumble because he hadn't taken the threat seriously enough. The humans are here, he announced. They've cleared the Xyloth from the outer systems. They want to discuss terms. The Vel representative, a creature with 4 arms and skin like polished metal, leaned forward. Terms? What terms? We didn't ask for terms. We asked for help. We asked, Moreth repeated, and they answered, but now they want payment. The chamber doors opened. A squad of human soldiers entered, their weapons held at low ready, their movements precise and efficient. Behind them came the commander, Tors, Vex had called him. Moreth had studied the file. Human, male, 47 standard cycles, combat history that included something his species called joint operations against unidentified threats. Moreth rose to his feet. Commander Tors, welcome to Unity's final light. We thank you for your assistance against the Xyloth swarm. Tors stopped at the center of the chamber. He didn't bow. He didn't salute. He just looked at the assembled council leaders with an expression that was unreadable. Let's skip the formalities, Tors said. You're dying, we can stop it, but we need something in return. Moreth felt his spine stiffen. The council does not negotiate under duress. Duress? Tor's eyebrow rose. You've lost 3/4 of your military. 5 of your member species are extinct. Your homeworlds are ash, and you're talking about duress. He stepped closer to the central table where the council leaders sat. You invited us here because you had no other choice. Now we're here and we're offering you a way out, but that way has a price. Mareth forced himself to remain calm. What price? Tors looked at him for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was flat. Surrender. The chamber exploded into chaos. The Vel representative rose to all 4 feet, his metal skin rippling with agitation. Impossible. The council does not surrender to anyone. We are the governing body of. Of what? Tors cut him off. What are you governing? Your fleets are gone, your populations are starving, your colonies are isolated, you have nothing to govern. He turned to Morath. I'm not asking you to surrender to the Xyloth. I'm asking you to surrender to us. Accept human authority, abide by human law, operate under human supervision. In exchange for what? Morath asked. In exchange for survival. Morath stared at the human. He could see the weariness in Tor's eyes, the exhaustion of someone who had fought too long, seen too much. But there was something else there too. Certainty. The Xyloth main force is 3 systems away, Tors continued. Our intelligence suggests they'll arrive within 6 months. When they do, the council will be destroyed. Every world, every species, everything you've built, gone. He paused. Unless we intervene. Morath's mind raced through the implications. Surrender to humanity. Accept human authority. It was unthinkable. The council had existed for thousands of years. It had survived wars, disasters, political upheaval. It had. The council will consider your proposal, Morath heard himself say. We will convene in emergency session too. You don't have time, Tors interrupted. The Xyloth advance is accelerating. Your fleet is gone. Your defensive positions are compromised. You have 6 months, maybe less, to make a decision. He turned and walked toward the chamber doors. Make the right choice, he said without looking back. Or don't, but if you don't call us again. We won't answer. The doors closed behind him. Morath looked at the remaining council leaders. The Vel representative had collapsed back into his chair. The Arkari envoy was staring at nothing. The smaller species representatives were crying. We have to surrender, someone whispered. Morath closed his eyes. He'd spent 312 years serving the council. He'd given everything to protect it. And now, in its darkest hour, he was being asked to give it away. But what was the alternative? Extinction. I need to think, Morath said. Give me time. Time was the one thing they didn't have. 6 months passed. The Xyloth main force arrived on schedule, exactly as the humans had predicted. The council watched from Unity's final light as the swarm swept through the outer systems, consuming everything in its path. There were no council fleets left to oppose them, no defensive positions to slow them. The humans didn't help. They'd withdrawn to their own territory, leaving the council to face the swarm alone. Morath had sent 3 desperate messages, each more frantic than the last. The humans acknowledged receipt but didn't respond. High Counselor, Soren reported, his voice trembling. The Xyloth will reach our position in 48 hours. The Trell homeworld has fallen. The Vel have gone dark. We're the only remaining council vessel in this sector. Morath nodded slowly. He'd known this was coming. He'd known since the day Tors walked out of the chamber that this was the only possible outcome. Send a message to the humans, he said. Tell them we accept their terms. Soren stared at him. High Counselor. Send the message. Tell them the council surrenders. Tell them we accept human authority. Tell them we'll agree to any conditions they require. Soren didn't move. He seemed frozen in place, unable to process what he'd just heard. Do it, Morath snapped. Now. The message was sent. The response came within 30 minutes. We acknowledge your surrender. the human transmission read. Human forces are en route to your position. Stand by for extraction. Morath watched the tactical display as human ships appeared on the edge of the system. Not 6 ships this time, but hundreds. They moved with precision, forming defensive positions around Unity's final light and engaging the Xyloth with the same ferocity Morath had witnessed 6 months ago. The battle lasted 9 hours. When it ended, the Xyloth main force had been reduced to scattered fragments. The remaining swarm elements retreated to the outer systems, their expansion pattern broken, their hive mind fractured. Morath watched it all from his quarters, feeling nothing. "High Counselor," Soren's voice came through the intercom. "Commander Tors is on the line. He's requesting an audience." Morath turned to face the door. "Send him in." Tors entered alone this time. No soldiers, no weapons. He looked older than Morath remembered, more tired, but the certainty in his eyes was still there. "You made the right choice," Tors said. Morath didn't respond. "I'm not going to apologize for the way we did this. You forced our hand. You had other options. You could have surrendered earlier, saved yourselves the suffering. But you didn't. You waited until the last possible moment." "I waited because I believed the Council could survive without surrender," Morath said. "I was wrong." Tors nodded slowly. "Now you're under our protection. Human forces will secure the remaining Council territories. We'll push the Xyloth back and establish defensive perimeters. Your species will survive." Morath looked up at the human, and in return, "We take control. Human governors will be appointed to each member world. Human law will supersede Council law. Human military will be the only military. Everything." Tors paused. "Your species will be allowed to maintain cultural sovereignty. You can keep your traditions, your languages, your internal governance structures within limits, but the ultimate authority will be ours." Morath closed his eyes. It was everything he'd feared and everything he'd expected. 300 years, he whispered. 300 years I've served the Council, and this is how it ends." Tors was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was softer than Morath had ever heard it. "I know what it's like to watch your world change, to see everything you believed in destroyed. I was there when humanity made the choice you just made. We surrendered too, not to aliens, but to the reality that we couldn't survive the way we were." Morath opened his eyes. "What do you mean?" Tors walked to the window. He looked out at the wreckage of the Xyloth swarm, and something passed across his face. 70 years ago, we were a dying species. We'd polluted our world, destroyed our environment, turned against each other in ways that seemed irredeemable. We were on the verge of extinction, and we knew it. He turned to face Morath. "We made a choice. We stopped fighting each other and started fighting for survival. We unified under a single authority. We accepted that the old ways were killing us and we changed. It was the hardest thing we've ever done." Morath stared at the human. "You're telling me this to give me hope." "I'm telling you this to make you understand. Surrender isn't the end, it's the beginning. The Council is dead, long live the humans, but your species will live, and that's what matters." Morath felt something shift inside him. Not hope, that was too strong, but something. "What do you want from us?" he asked. "What are you really after?" Tors looked at him with those strange, intense eyes. "We want allies," he said. "We want to build something better than what came before. We can't do it alone. We need you and every other species in this galaxy to help us build a new order." Morath nodded slowly. "I understand." "Good," Tors extended his hand. "Welcome to the Terran sphere." The formal surrender ceremony took place on Unity's final light. Morath stood at the center of the main chamber, surrounded by the remnants of the Council leadership. They looked smaller now, diminished. The weight of their defeat hung over them like a shroud. Tors stood opposite them, flanked by human officials and military officers. The chamber was crowded with observers from both sides, alien dignitaries and human personnel, watching history unfold. Marath stepped forward. "On behalf of the Galactic Council," he began, his voice steady despite everything, "I hereby surrender all authority, jurisdiction, and sovereignty to the Terran sphere. I acknowledge human supremacy in all matters of governance, military operations, and interstellar relations. I submit to the terms provided and accept the consequences of this decision." He paused. The chamber was silent. "May this surrender mark not the end of our civilizations, but the beginning of a new understanding. May we find in humanity not masters, but partners in the continued struggle for survival." Torres stepped forward. He didn't look triumphant. He looked relieved almost. "On behalf of the Terran sphere," Torres said, "I accept this surrender. We acknowledge the authority of this document and pledge to protect the populations and territories of the former council members from all threats, internal and external." He extended his hand. Marath took it. The ceremony lasted 3 hours. There were speeches, signings, formal declarations. By the time it ended, Marath was exhausted, physically, mentally, emotionally. Torres found him in his quarters after the ceremony ended. "You did well," Torres said, "better than I expected." Marath looked up from the report he'd been trying to read. "I did what was necessary." "That's exactly what I mean." Torres sat down across from him. "I've seen a lot of surrenders. Most of them are ugly, bitter. People fighting until the last possible moment and then blaming everyone but themselves for the outcome. You didn't do that." Marath didn't respond. "I need to tell you something," Torres continued. "Something that's not in the official records." Marath set down the report. "What?" "The Xyloth threat isn't eliminated. We pushed them back, but we couldn't destroy them. They're regrouping in the outer systems and they'll be back." Marath felt something cold settle in his stomach. "When?" "We don't know. Years, maybe decades. But they'll be back." Torres leaned forward. "That's why we needed this surrender. Not because we wanted to conquer you, although, if I'm being honest, that was part of it. But because we needed the Council's resources, its territory, its population, to fight the war that's coming." Marath stared at him. "You could have just told us." "We tried that. 70 years ago, when we first encountered the Xyloth, we tried to warn the Council. We sent diplomatic missions. We shared intelligence. The Council dismissed us as primitive savages." Torres shook his head. "We learned our lesson. When the Council started dying, we knew there was only one way to get your attention. We had to wait until you had no other choice. We had to make you desperate enough to accept terms." Marath was silent for a long moment. "Your species is terrifying," he finally said. "We know." Marath looked at the human. He tried to find anger, hatred, resentment, but all he felt was exhaustion. "What do you need from me?" he asked. Tor's eyes met his. "I need you to help us, to talk to the other species, to convince them that this isn't the end, to help us build something new." Marath nodded. "I can do that." "Good." Torres rose to his feet. "I'll be in touch. We have a lot of work to do." The human left and Marath sat alone in his quarters. He thought about the thousands of years of council history that had just ended. He thought about his own life, his own service, everything he'd given. And he thought about what came next. The council was dead. Long live the Terran sphere. The transition to human authority was not peaceful. Marath had expected resistance. The council species had spent centuries building their own civilizations, their own identities. They didn't want to be ruled by humans. They didn't want to accept authority from a species they'd once dismissed as primitive. But the humans had planned for this too. They deployed their military forces to maintain order. They appointed governors to each member world. They established courts, enforcement agencies, administrative structures. Within 18 months, the former council territories had been fully integrated into what the humans called the Terran sphere. Marath watched it all unfold from his position as the human-appointed liaison for former council affairs. It wasn't a powerful position. He'd been stripped of any real authority, but it gave him a perspective that few others had. "They're efficient," he told Tors during one of their regular meetings. "I'll give you that." Tors nodded. "We learned from our mistakes. Our own unification took decades. Wars, rebellions, civil conflict. We don't want to repeat that here. So you're building a better version of humanity." Tors smiled. "We're trying. We don't always succeed, but we're trying." Marath studied the human's face. He'd known Tors for 2 years now, and he'd come to respect him. Not as a conqueror, but as someone who had seen the worst of what his species could do and was determined to change it. "Why did you really do this?" Marath asked. "The expansion, the conquest, the surrender, what was the point?" Tors was silent for a moment. 70 years ago, we were on the verge of extinction," he finally said. "We destroyed our planet, our society, our future. We had a choice: continue fighting each other or fight for survival. We chose survival." He paused. But survival wasn't enough. We couldn't go back to the old ways, the wars, the pollution, the divisions. We had to change. We had to become something new. Morath nodded slowly. "And now you're trying to make the galaxy something new." "Yes," Tors looked at him. "We don't want to rule through fear. We don't want to be tyrants. We want to build a civilization that can survive the Xyloth and everything else the galaxy throws at us." Morath thought about his own species, his own people. They'd been dying for 3 years and the humans had saved them. That was the truth, stripped of all politics, all ideology. "Will you succeed?" Morath asked. Tor's smile was small. "We have to." The years passed. The Xyloth didn't return, not yet, but the humans continued to prepare. They built defenses, stockpiled resources, trained their forces, and they continued to expand, absorbing more and more of the galaxy into the Terran sphere. Morath watched and waited. It was 40 years after the surrender when he finally understood what the humans had been building. He was at an official ceremony, the induction of a new member species into the Terran sphere, and he saw it in the faces of the aliens standing beside him. They weren't afraid, they weren't resentful, they were hopeful. The humans had done what no council administration had ever managed. They'd created a civilization that its members believed in, not because they were forced to, but because they wanted to. "It's working," Morath said to Tors after the ceremony. "I didn't think it would, but it's working." Tors nodded. "It's taken a long time, but yes, it's working." Morath looked at the human, older now, gray-haired, worn down by decades of work, but still there, still fighting. "What now?" Morath asked. Tors smiled. "Now we wait. The Xyloth are still out there, other threats too. We stay ready and we hope we never have to fight again." "That's not very human of you." "No," Tors agreed, "but we're trying to be better than that." Morath nodded slowly. He thought about the council, about the thousands of years of history that had led to this moment, and he thought about the future. The humans had taken everything, but they'd given something back too: purpose, direction, a reason to keep going. "Thank you," Morath said. Tors looked at him. "For what?" "For saving us, for giving us something to believe in." Tors was silent for a moment. Then he extended his hand. "We're in this together," he said. "All of us, that's the point." Morath took the hand. And for the first time in 60 years, he believed it. 5 decades after the surrender, Morath was dying. It was a natural death. His species had a lifespan of 350 standard cycles, and he was reaching the end. He'd lived long enough to see the Terran sphere become the dominant power in the known galaxy. He'd seen species integrate, prosper, and grow. He'd seen the Xyloth threat contained, then neutralized, then eliminated. He'd seen everything the humans had promised come true. Tors was gone too. The human commander had died 20 years ago, killed in a minor skirmish with a rogue species that had attacked a Terran colony. Morath had mourned him, more than he'd expected to. They'd become friends in their own way. Sauron, Moreth said, his voice weak. Is there any message from the Terran government? His aide, now as old as Moreth had been when the surrender happened, shook his head. Nothing specific. They send their regards. Moreth nodded slowly. He understood. The humans had moved on. The surrender was ancient history to them. They were building something new, something better. And that was the point, wasn't it? That was what Tors had always said. We need to remember, Moreth murmured. Remember what, High Counselor? Moreth opened his eyes. Remember what happened. Remember why we surrendered. Remember that survival matters more than pride. Sauron nodded, but Moreth could see the confusion in his eyes. The young ones didn't understand. They'd grown up in the Terran sphere. They'd never known the council, never known the war, never known the desperation. They didn't remember what it was like to beg for help and get something worse. But Moreth remembered. He remembered the human ships arriving, the ferocity of their attacks, the cold calculation in their eyes. He remembered watching his civilization die and knowing that surrender was the only option. He remembered the fear. And he remembered the hope. The humans are cruel, Moreth said softly. They're violent, unpredictable, and terrifying, but they're also the only reason we survived. Sauron was silent. Moreth closed his eyes. He could feel the end approaching, the darkness pulling at him. He was ready. Don't forget, he whispered. Don't ever forget. The darkness took him. Centuries later, the Terran sphere had become the dominant civilization in the galaxy. The former council species had integrated fully into human society, their cultures preserved but their sovereignty surrendered. The surrender was taught in schools as a historical necessity. The Xyloth threat was used as justification. The humans were portrayed as saviors, not conquerors. But there were those who remembered. They passed the story down through generations, whispered in secret, shared between those who knew. The story of the Council's fall and humanity's rise. The story of how the galaxy's most powerful civilization had begged for mercy and gotten something far more dangerous. Commander Tor's words were still repeated, still debated, still feared. We came to eliminate the threat, but we also came to claim what was already ours. The humans had waited. They'd planned. They'd built their civilization in secret, preparing for the day when the Council would fall. And when that day came, they'd been ready. The galaxy learned to fear humanity, not for its weapons, not for its tactics, but for its patience, for its willingness to wait decades, centuries, for the right moment to strike. The Xyloth had been the catalyst, the Council had been the victim, humanity had been the predator. And the galaxy had never been the same. On a Terran military station at the edge of the explored galaxy, a young officer reviewed the archives. She was human, newly commissioned, eager to understand the history she'd inherited. She found the file on the Council's surrender, read it carefully, and then sat back in her chair. "Commander," she called to her superior, "is this accurate? The surrender terms, the conditions, the Council really agreed to all this?" Her superior, an older woman with gray-streaked hair and tired eyes, looked at the file and smiled. "They agreed," she said. "They had no other choice." The young officer frowned. "But why? Why didn't they just fight?" "Because they couldn't win. The Xyloth had already destroyed most of their military. They were desperate." "But still," the officer said, "surrendering everything, their sovereignty, their civilization. They survived, didn't they?" The young officer was silent for a moment. Then she nodded slowly. "Yes," she said, "they survived." The older woman walked to the window. Outside, the stars stretched into infinity. "That's what matters," she said. "That's what always matters." The young officer looked at her superior, and something passed between them, an understanding that went beyond words. "Permission to speak freely?" the young officer asked. "Granted. I don't understand why we do things this way, why we conquer, why we demand surrender, why we're so ruthless." The older woman turned to face her. Because we have to, she said. Because the galaxy is full of threats, and the only way to survive is to be stronger than everyone else. The Council learned that lesson too late. We learned it early. The young officer nodded slowly. And the Xyloth? Gone, we eliminated them. Because they were a threat. Because they refused to surrender. The young officer stared at her superior, and she understood. The humans didn't just fight to win. They fought to exterminate. They didn't accept surrender from enemies, only from allies. The Council had survived because it had surrendered. The Xyloth had died because they hadn't. It was a terrifying realization. But it was also, somehow, reassuring. The humans would always do what was necessary to protect their civilization. They'd never hesitate, never falter, never second-guess. And that, more than anything else, was why they'd won. Thank you, the young officer said, for explaining. The older woman nodded. Now you know, use that knowledge wisely. I will. The young officer returned to her duties, but she never forgot what she'd learned. The galaxy was full of dangers. The humans had faced them all and emerged victorious. Not because they were the strongest or the smartest or the most advanced, but because they were willing to do whatever it took to survive. And in a universe where survival was the only law, that was enough. It was enough. The end.